Welcome to the Home Like Stories channel. Don't forget to subscribe, it will be interesting. And we begin.
It was late, far too late to be driving through the endless stretch of desert highway with no destination in mind. I wasn't running away, exactly. I just needed to get away from everything for a while. Work, relationships, the endless monotony of city life. So, I drove. The gas gauge had been creeping toward empty for the last hour, and with no gas stations or rest stops in sight, panic began to set in. Then, like an answer to a silent prayer, a flickering neon sign appeared in the distance. Its letters spelled out, Desert Haven Motel. The motel sat on the side of the highway like a forgotten relic. The building was a low, single-story structure with a faded, peeling exterior. A few dim lights illuminated the parking lot, where 4 or 5 cars were parked. I pulled in, grateful for the respite. Inside the lobby, the air was heavy with the scent of stale coffee and something faintly metallic. Behind the counter stood an older man, his weathered face and tired eyes giving him the appearance of someone who had spent a lifetime tethered to this place. His name tag read Earl. "Need a room?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Yeah," I replied, my voice cracking from exhaustion. Earl slid a brass key across the counter. "Room 6, he said. "Breakfast starts at 6 a.m. if you're hungry." I nodded, not bothering to ask about the breakfast menu. All I wanted was a bed. The room was exactly what you'd expect from a remote desert motel, a sagging mattress, faded wallpaper, and a TV that looked older than I was. I didn't care. After locking the door and kicking off my shoes, I collapsed onto the bed. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I first heard it. A faint sound, almost like whispers, coming from outside my window. I sat up, my heart pounding. The curtains were drawn, but a faint glow seeped through them. Gathering my courage, I pulled the curtain aside. Nothing. The parking lot was empty, save for the same cars I had seen earlier. The neon sign buzzed faintly in the distance, casting an eerie glow over the gravel. I shook my head, convincing myself it was just my imagination, and went back to bed. Morning came slowly, the sun struggling to break through a layer of dusty clouds. I left my room to find the lobby, hoping for coffee or at least some human interaction. But the lobby was empty. Earl was nowhere to be found. Instead, a young woman stood behind the counter, her bright smile a stark contrast to Earl's sullen demeanor. "Morning," she chirped. "How'd you sleep?" "Fine," I lied. "Where's Earl?" She frowned. "Earl? There's no one here by that name." My stomach sank. "He checked me in last night." Her smile faltered. "You must be mistaken. I'm the only one who works the night shift." I didn't press the issue, but unease settled over me like a heavy blanket. Grabbing a cup of lukewarm coffee from the counter, I stepped outside to clear my head. That's when I noticed it, the pickup truck in the far corner of the parking lot. It hadn't been there last night, I was sure of it. The truck's windows were fogged, its paint faded and peeling. As I approached, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The driver's door was slightly ajar, revealing the interior. Inside were clothes, suitcases, and other personal belongings, all covered in a thick layer of dust. It looked as if the truck had been abandoned for years, yet something about it felt fresh, recent. "Everything okay?" a voice called out, making me jump. I turned to see the young woman from the lobby. She was standing a few feet away, her expression unreadable. "Yeah, just looking," I said. Her eyes flicked toward the truck, then back to me. "I wouldn't worry about that. Some things are better left alone." As the day wore on, I began to notice the absence of other guests. The cars in the parking lot were still there, but I hadn't seen anyone leave their rooms. No voices, no movement. That night, the whispers returned, louder this time. They weren't just outside my window, they were everywhere, in the walls, the air, even inside my head. I couldn't take it anymore. Throwing on my jacket, I stepped outside to confront whatever was making the noise. The parking lot was empty, but the whispers persisted, guiding me toward the motel's back entrance. Behind the motel, I found a narrow staircase leading down to a rusted metal door. It looked out of place, like it didn't belong in a building this old. Without thinking, I pushed it open. The air inside was cold and damp, carrying the unmistakable scent of decay. The room was dimly lit by a single, flickering bulb. On the walls were photographs, hundreds of them, showing people who looked eerily familiar. My breath caught in my throat as I realized why. They were the guests I had seen, or thought I'd seen, the night before. Earl was in one of the photos, his face younger, smiling. So was the young woman from the lobby. My hands trembled as I turned to leave, but the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. Suddenly, Earl appeared in the doorway, his expression blank. "You shouldn't have come here," he said. Before I could respond, the room began to spin. The photographs melted into the walls, the floor gave way, and I was falling into darkness. I woke up in my car, parked on the side of the highway. The motel was gone, replaced by an empty stretch of desert. My gas gauge was full, my wallet untouched. To this day, I don't know what happened at Desert Haven Motel. But sometimes, when I drive at night, I see a flickering neon sign in the distance, calling me back. And I wonder, if I stopped again, would I ever leave? Now I'll tell you the second story. Make some tea or coffee and we'll begin. Growing up in a small farming town in Iowa, I was used to quiet nights and endless fields of corn stretching out as far as the eye could see. But there was one field, just outside of town, that no one talked about, let alone dared to enter. People called it Harrow's Field, after the farmer who owned it decades ago. Legend had it that strange things happened in that field. Disappearances. Lights in the sky. And, of course, the whispers. I never paid much attention to the stories. To me, they were just tales meant to keep kids from wandering too far from home. That is, until the summer of 2006, when my best friend, Will, and I decided to prove everyone wrong. It started as a joke. We were sitting in Will's garage, sweating in the thick July heat, flipping through an old local history book his dad had lying around. That's when we stumbled across a chapter on Harrow's Field. There was a grainy black and white photo of the field, surrounded by a handwritten account from 1932. A farmhand claimed to have seen shadowy figures moving through the rows at night, followed by a voice calling my name. "Creepy," I said, closing the book. Will grinned. "You know what we have to do, right?" "Do what?" "Go out there. Spend the night. See if the whispers are real." At first, I laughed it off. But the more he talked about it, the more curious I became. What if the stories were true? What if there really was something out there? By the time the sun set, we had flashlights, a couple of sleeping bags, and enough snacks to last us the night. We told our parents we were camping in the backyard and set off for Harrow's Field. Harrow's Field was about a mile outside of town, past a row of abandoned barns. By the time we got there, the sky was pitch black, and the air was unnervingly still. The field looked just like any other, rows upon rows of corn, swaying gently in the breeze. But there was something off about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "You ready?" Will asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I lied. We stepped into the field, the stalks towering over us like walls. The farther we went, the darker it got, until our flashlights were the only source of light. It started around midnight. We were sitting in the middle of the field, eating chips and joking about how ridiculous the whole thing was when we heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it wasn't random. It was a voice, soft and raspy, saying something I couldn't quite make out. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Will nodded, his eyes wide. It sounded like someone calling my name. We turned off our flashlights, plunging ourselves into darkness. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were coming from all around us, moving through the rows of corn. "Who's there?" Will called out. No response. Just the whispers, growing closer. Then, the lights appeared. At first, it was just a faint glow in the distance, hovering above the field. But as we watched, the glow split into multiple orbs, each one a pulsing, bluish white. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. Will didn't answer. He was frozen, staring at the lights as they began to move toward us. We scrambled to our feet and started running, the stalks scratching our arms and faces as we tried to find our way out. But no matter which direction we went, the lights followed, bobbing and weaving through the rows like they were alive. And then we saw them. Silhouettes, tall and thin, standing at the edges of the field. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching us. "Go, go, go!" Will yelled, grabbing my arm. We ran faster than I thought possible, bursting out of the field and onto the dirt road. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, the field was quiet again. No lights. No whispers. Just the rustle of the corn in the wind. We didn't say a word to each other the whole walk home. The next morning, we decided to go back, convinced that what we'd seen was just some kind of elaborate prank. But when we got to the field, it was gone. The corn had been flattened, the stalks burned to ash. There was no sign of the lights, the figures, or the whispers. We tried to tell people what had happened, but no one believed us. They said it was just our imaginations, fueled by too many scary stories. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the whispers. Third story. There's a part of every city that time forgets, a place buried beneath the weight of history and neglect. For us, it was the old subway tunnels beneath downtown. Built in the 1920s and abandoned decades later, the tunnels had become the stuff of urban legend. Some said they were haunted. Others claimed they were home to a secret society. But the story that stuck with me was the one about the missing workers, the men who had vanished during the final days of construction, never to be seen again. I never believed in any of it, of course. At least, not until that night. It started with a stupid bet. My co-workers and I were out for drinks after work, trading ghost stories and trying to one-up each other. You know, Dave said, leaning back in his chair, those old subway tunnels are supposed to be cursed. Cursed? I laughed. Come on. I'm serious, he insisted. People say if you go down there at night, you can still hear the workers screaming. Like they're trapped down there, begging for help. Yeah, right, I scoffed. Dave smirked. Tell you what. You go down there, spend an hour in the tunnels, and I'll buy your drinks for the next month. I should have said no. But I didn't. The entrance to the tunnels was hidden behind a chain-link fence at the edge of a construction site. Dave and a couple of our co-workers came with me, just to make sure I went through with it. You sure about this? One of them asked as I climbed through the gap in the fence. Piece of cake, I said, more to convince myself than anyone else. The stairs leading down to the tunnels were crumbling and slick with moss. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of damp concrete filled my lungs. At the bottom, I turned on my flashlight and stepped into the darkness. The tunnel was wider than I'd expected, with arched ceilings and rusted tracks running down the center. Graffiti covered the walls, some of it decades old. At first, it was just eerie. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, making you hyper-aware of every sound. But then, about 10 minutes in, I heard it, a faint tapping sound, like someone knocking on metal. Hello? I called out, my voice echoing down the tunnel. No response. The tapping continued, growing louder, more rhythmic. It was coming from up ahead. As I walked deeper into the tunnel, my flashlight flickered. I banged it against my hand, but the beam remained weak and unsteady. That's when I saw it, a single boot lying in the middle of the tracks, old and covered in dirt. It looked like something out of the 1920s, with laces frayed and the leather cracked with age. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. That's when the smell hit me, a rancid, metallic stench that made my stomach churn. I dropped the boot and took a step back. That's when I noticed the writing on the wall behind me. It wasn't graffiti. These were old markings, carved into the concrete. The words were jagged and uneven, as if they'd been scratched in desperation. Help US. They're watching. I felt a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. And then, I heard something else. A whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. A voice, low and urgent, saying, "Turn back." I spun around, shining my flashlight down the tunnel. That's when I saw them, shadows, tall and thin, moving toward me. At first, I thought they were other people, but something about the way they moved wasn't right. Their steps were jerky, unnatural, like puppets on strings. "Hey!" I called out, trying to sound brave. "Who's there?" The shadows didn't respond. They just kept coming, their forms growing clearer with each passing second. That's when I saw their faces, or rather, their lack of faces. I ran. I don't remember how far or how fast, but I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they were going to give out. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more frantic. The shadows seemed to close in from all sides, their faceless heads tilting as if they were mocking me. When I finally reached the stairs, I didn't stop. I climbed as fast as I could, bursting out into the night air and collapsing onto the pavement. Dave and the others were waiting for me, their faces pale. "What the hell happened down there?" Dave asked. I couldn't speak. I just shook my head, gasping for breath. I quit my job the next day. I couldn't explain what I'd seen, or why I kept hearing whispers whenever I closed my eyes. A week later, the construction site above the tunnels collapsed, killing 3 workers. They said it was an accident. But I knew better. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed. And those tunnels? They're one of them.
Thanks for watching and listening. Don't forget to subscribe.